Dr. Gail Presbey coming out of Detroit, and somebody that I've known for many, many years. Both of us was in Addis Ababa, that memorable conference. And
Right.
at one stage, she was pretty close to me, just up in Poughkeepsie. So she's also a New Yorker. So Professor Presby is also in the, is it Philosopher's Peace? That was the conference that you were yesterday or today? Yes,
Yes.
yeah, they have the annual conference and she is part of that. So welcome to you. Happy that you can come back to Humanitas to be with us and to give us, you know, as always, very, very important information with regard to our struggle. Thank you, and happy for you to be here.
Well, and welcome, and I'm glad to have a chance to share with you some of my enthusiasm for a recent book called Decolonial Ecology by Malcolm Ferdinand. And I thought in the earlier program, somebody just before me also had the title Decolonial Ecology, and I wondered if it was the movement or this book they were going to talk about, but I guess I will just, in the beginning of my paper, I talk about this book, and then in relation to some of Malcolm Ferdinand's ideas in relation to a professor of philosophy from Kenya, who I've been writing on for quite a few years, that's Odera Oruka of Kenya. So at a certain point, I'll bring in some of the issues that Oruka raised, and I don't have big conclusions, but I just find interesting juxtapositions. And on this issue of the centrality of decolonizing in order to have robust environmentalism, the two go hand in hand, according to these authors. And so when I saw the theme of your conference, I thought I'd like to raise it. Yeah, that's the title of the book. Yes. Polity Press. Angela Davis writes the foreword. It just came out this year, 2022. So in the recent book, Malcolm Ferdinand wrote on decolonial ecology. As he explains, decolonial ecology is concerned with overthrowing the economic ideology that turns human and non-human living environments into resources servicing an unequal capitalist enrichment. Is everything fine? Is the translator able to hear me, etc.? I hope. Okay, let me know if I have to be louder. While his book is new, he notes that this movement for decolonial ecology reached an important level of public acknowledgement when in 1991, the first People of Color Leadership Summit was held in Washington, D.C. There, speakers insisted that reconnecting with Mother Earth could only be achieved if it was wedded to the decolonial demand for the cultural, economic, and political liberation from centuries of colonialism. And let me just quickly reflect on the year 1991. That's also the year that Professor Odera Oruka was hosting a conference on the environment in Nairobi, and he edited this book of papers, Philosophy, Humanity, and Ecology. This was the year that FISP, the International Federation of Philosophers, met in Nairobi, and ecology was their theme. So 1991, these were important issues. And if you look at Oruka's work, it shows that he knew authors in the 1990s who were predicting all these problems with climate change, predicting that all the coasts and all the islands would have these problems. So since the 1990s, there has been, I'm sure earlier people should have known as well. But to get back to Ferdinand, there's a decolonial demand for the cultural, economic, and political liberation from centuries of colonialism. And in his book, Ferdinand asks the question, what is a non-colonial way of being with each other? How can we meet with dignity and justice? As he explains, he writes from what he calls the conceptual sea of the Caribbean. Storms are raging, fueled by climate change, and they batter Caribbean islands. But problems in the Caribbean began earlier with the practice of slavery. Only a decolonial ecology can result in freedom from the practices of slavery, social violence, and political injustice. He argues that some of the world's violence and injustice happens from within the environmental community, or at least shows itself in environmental policy. The problem being that in both the US and France, people of color are not in leadership positions in these organizations. Likewise, the pantheon of environmental thinkers are mostly white males who have ignored many ecological disasters created in the colonial and post-colonial context. For example, Great Britain and France have exploited mines in Africa, even extracting uranium and other dangerous metals in Gabon, Niger, South Africa, and Madagascar. He notes that Aimé Césaire in 1950, Frantz Fanon in 1961, and Thomas Sankara in 1986, each criticized how colonial powers changed the way that the land was used and the relationship between people and the land. They insisted that decolonization would usher in a new way to be related to the land, and even a way of relating to the sun, prefiguring our contemporary discussions of solar power. This is more evidence that decolonization and environmentalism belong together. It is an intellectual heritage that has been overlooked. Ferdinand argues that slavery was practiced in the Caribbean in order to practice colonial inhabitation, which had deforestation as a key method. Ferdinand also talks about, he refers to Wangari Maathai as a theorist and activist who explained that both colonial and anti-colonial forces marginalized women. Colonial ways of inhabiting the earth amount to matricide, he charges. And he asks, who practices matrogenesis? The maroon communities, he argues. Colonial people were prevented from making the new land they arrived at into their motherland. As he explains, quote, the urgency of the struggle against both global warming and the pollution of the earth is intertwined with the urgency of political, epistemic, scientific, legal, and philosophical struggles to dismantle the colonial structures of living together and the ways of inhabiting the earth that still maintain the domination of racialized people, particularly women, in modernity's hold, end quote. Ferdinand, who is of African descent and born in Martinique, says it is not enough to embrace an eco-Marxist understanding of the world, like Jason Moore and other eco-Marxists, seeing the grave injustices as due to material conditions and economic forces. Ferdinand also critiques the rampant gender discrimination in our world and notes the parallels between harming women and harming the environment, including animals. Ferdinand wants the environmental movement to see that we humans must make free political decisions to change our relationship to nature. But can it happen with the weight of economics against the movement, with fossil fuel companies pouring their billions into lobbying Congress? He turns to Hannah Arendt for her conception of the world as including Earth, our bodies, nature, and so forth, but being made up of our relationships, all of the encounters of the in-between, as she would say, and human deeds and words. Our challenge is to live with each other, understand each other, challenge each other, and act together to end injustice and save our environment. Or as Ferdinand puts it, we are challenged to answer this question: how can a world be made on Earth between humans and with non-humans? So that's a big challenge he puts forward to us. And now I wanted to switch and tell you all a bit about Adair Aruka, and maybe many of you know him already. He's I think his works on political philosophy, justice, injustice, hunger, poverty, inequality are perhaps known better than his work on the environment. And of course, he's also well known for his Sage Philosophy Project, where he interviewed many wise elders in the Kenyan countryside and considered that their wisdom should be incorporated into our history of African philosophy. Well, I actually have a book in progress, hopefully out soon with Bloomsbury. So the question is how to tell you some of this in a nutshell. But I wanted to raise some of the questions that he raised about colonization and colonialism, knowing that he's also someone who very much was adamantly defending the environment. And I do think there's a lot in what Aruka says that has implications for contemporary land reform and sustainable agriculture movements, both in Kenya and elsewhere. And Aruka's emphasis on the earth as a commonwealth could be an argument against national sovereignty and in favor of free migration, which is certainly an anti-Hardin move. He was a big critic of Garrett Hardin, who you might remember, the lifeboat ethics theorist. But Aruka realizes that his assertion that the earth belongs in some way to all humans argues against the claim by First Nations of the Americas, or American Indians, as Aruka called them at the time, that they have a right of first occupation. And of course, this is also a theme in Ferdinand's book. The Maroons, those who are brought by the slave trade against their will, end up in the Americas, which are already inhabited, even though the colonizers do some doublethink and sometimes act as if they're uninhabited lands for the grabbing. But so Ferdinand himself is talking about how to come up with a Maroon identity. And he talks about how Maroons make the Americas their home by living in the forest, while the colonial world chops down all the forests. So he sees a Maroon survival in connection to forestation, right, and the colonial deforestation. So Aruka himself is talking about this, this question of who can stay. And he says, if the world really belongs to all of us, then you can't eject the colonizers. But I would say, well, maybe you can't eject the people who were colonizers, but they can't remain continuing as colonizers. If they remain, it has to be on a completely different footing. It has to be on an egalitarian footing and not continuing the colonization. And Aruka raises these issues in the context of his critique of Hardin, where he explained that the current prosperity of the North was due to the historical and contemporary dispossession and exploitation of the global South. And in an article he wrote with Callistus Juma, he says, but given the organic constitution of life and principles of parental earth ethics, the former colonies have a legitimate claims to such possessions. In other words, the former colonies should share in the wealth that was taken from them from the global North. This is something which Olufemi Taiwo is going to talk about in his book, where he talks about reparations involving addressing the environmental injustice. And so actually, I want to make an aside to that other book, but you can also tell me how much time I have left, because we didn't really talk about it in advance. I wanted to talk about Taiwo's book and then tie it in with some of the things that Aruka said.
You have plenty of time.
I do. Oh,
Yeah.
okay, I will continue. Thank you. So Olufemi O. Taiwo's new book, I say the O because many of us know two philosophers named Olufemi Taiwo. So I'm talking about the one who in 2021 published a book about reparations. And in this book, as well as his talk at Harvard University and probably other talks of his in 2021 as well, he argues that colonization, as well as post-colonial economies of extraction, led to environmental degradation that scientists know now will hurt island and equatorial nations first and hardest. So this is something that impacts, right, Malcolm Ferdinand, who's from Martinique, the Caribbean islands, and also Kenya is also right on the equator, and Kenya has a coast along the Indian Ocean. So the equatorial and island nations are hurt the hardest. The BBC News called it climate apartheid, meaning that the rich will escape overheating, hunger, and conflict, according to Philip Olson, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty. But I'm not sure everyone will really escape it, but he said so. Given that historical injustice, current reparations can and should be aimed at climate mitigation, climate adaptation, reparations for loss and damage, resettlement, and carbon removal. These costs should be paid by the global North, which benefited from their from this arrangement. They benefited from their colonialist and racist programs of action for centuries. Taiwo uses the definition of racism provided by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, which is, quote, the state-sanctioned and or legal production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerabilities to premature death, end quote. Taiwo surveyed other competing ideas for reparations, but chose to focus on climate reparations, even though he admits that in his version, everyone will benefit, including the global North. He likes other reparation schemes as well, but prefers this one because it is forward-looking. In other words, looking into the future and seeing what looms ahead. This concern with the future was also a key theme of Odera Aruka. In 1995, he hosted the World Future Studies Federation conference, and one of their keynote speakers spoke about the coming climate catastrophe. And so to be future oriented, to look at trends and to prepare to meet future challenges was something Aruka was also very concerned with. And so these recent theorists, Taiwo, Ferdinand, as well as Aruka, can tie together the topics of colonization and ecology. And I want to say Arouca was in the vanguard of this environmental movement. And then he died early, 1995, before he could comment further upon developments intended to address climate change. And I skipped over, but I can just mention that Arouca, as early as 1973, was very committed to the environmental cause, as testified to me by Robin Atfield, who was at University of Nairobi in 73. And according to Atfield, it was Arouca who got Atfield interested in environmental ethics issues. And Atfield, as well as Wirkene Kelvessa and several others, for many years were devoted to this environmental ethics issue. But now, even though I've talked about the ways in which all three of these thinkers are embracing this idea, we must have decolonization, justice, equality, hand in hand with environmentalism. Nevertheless, Arouca in 1997, in one of his articles, embraced a concept of property that I recognize is advocated earlier by John Locke and used to justify conquest of American Indian lands in the past. The idea that if a resource is not used, it can be taken away by those who will use it. And if you look at an article that Arouca wrote on parental earth ethics, that's what he says. He stipulates that in his family model, so he talks about the earth as a family. And then he says in his family model, if some members of the family aren't using what they are given, then their siblings can take it away and use it. He explains that his model, quote, allows creative and hardworking members of the family to repossess undeveloped possessions of the idle relatives and develop them for use to posterity, end quote. So now, this is interesting for several reasons, which I'm about to explore, but let me first mention it is interesting how implications regarding women's ownership of land are not drawn from this argument. After all, it is women who work the land. Why can't they own it? And if we did, a world history of colonialism, we would see how often the colonial powers only wanted to give land to like one male that they said was the head of the family. And women, what's that great book I read? It's on Algeria, women coming to court and saying, I'm the one who worked this land, the title deed should be given to me. And the French are like, no, we can't give a title deed to a woman. And then the problem is some of these same practices also happened in Kenya after the British left and Kenya was independent. There was nevertheless this continued practice, which Wangari Maathai was very concerned about, where now Kenyans, as part of their own Kenyan government, were going and wanting to give title deeds to a male head of household, when in fact she said the Gikuyu had practices that said the land belongs to all. And I mentioned at least one study of Zioki's 1993 study of 150 households in Mumbuni location, Machakos district in Kenya. She found that none of the land was registered in the name of a daughter. 55% of land deeds named the husband, 27% named the son. Only 12% of women had their name on any land deed. So when Arouca says the land should be given to the most productive, right? Why is there so little land in the name of any women on the land registration documents? And in some cases where a woman's name was on there, For example, Kiatu, her name was there. She was holding the land in trust for her sons and not her daughters. And so Nzioki, who did this study, thinks it's very important that daughters can inherit the land. And of course, there have been some interesting recent cases in Kenya with women judges upholding the rights of women to hold and inherit land, etc. So, but the issue of women aside, what do we make of Aruka's claim that land lying idle can be given to those who will use it? So from Ward Churchill in 2003 and so many others have said, this idea of loss, this idea of use is so unfair because you have First Nations communities who are living with a kind of agriculture where they are, you could say, reaping the benefits of the land around them and making a living without tilling the soil, and tilling being a very destructive to the earth, leading to erosion, leading to desertification. I mean, so why have this narrow idea of use that's based on a European idea? And Churchill also says, colonizers coming to the Americas considered Native people to be possessors of the land only when they could then negotiate and sell it to the colonizers. And if they wouldn't agree to sell, then the lands could be taken by force. And the rationale for taking the land by force was the idea that current inhabitants weren't using it. And this isn't just history. I mean, take a look at the cutting down of the rainforest in Brazil today. The same idea. If you want to claim this land, you have to cut down the forest, or we'll say you're not using it. Okay. So European colonizers themselves saw firsthand that their practices of cutting down forests led to erosion and the spread of disease. Both Churchill and Ferdinand have exact evidence for this in their books. They knew that what they were doing was destructive. This narrow concept of use of the land has had devastating effects in some areas. And so in these circumstances, it seems to be unfair and discriminatory to use these definitions of use to justify colonizers taking away lands of indigenous communities. Environmentalists like Chico Mendes organized rubber tappers, many of whom were African descended, relocated to the Amazon area in search of livelihoods. But Mendes was able to help the Native American communities of Brazil and the rubber tappers who came in from the coast to join forces politically and environmentally to protect the Amazon rainforest by practicing both rubber tapping and Brazil nut harvesting, because as you may know, the Brazil nut can't produce under conditions of agroforestry. The Brazil nut tree only can produce in conditions of the rainforest. And so these two communities can live in harmony with each other and the environment if they aren't being displaced by land speculators who have the backing of, for example, the Bolsonaro government. So Mendes explained that rainforests provide important crops for humans only in the context of these uncut forests. And so the issue here is not to keep foreigners out per se, but for the non-indigenous, in this case, rubber tappers, who generations ago were brought to the area in the 19th century as virtual slaves in a system of debt bondage, to coordinate with indigenous people, those were Mendes's terms, to coordinate with indigenous people and work together to preserve the environment, finding ways to live in harmony with the environment. But now, even after I've said all that, we can also turn to Brazil for an example of communities struggling for equality and justice who uphold at least a version of this same centuries-long argument of Locke's that Aruka used, that if someone has an asset like fallow land, while others are willing to work that land, then the landless can take that land and make it fruitful. This is in fact the tactic of the landless workers movement in Brazil. Now they're not, I'm not going to say they're a colonial movement. They're not, obviously. They're a landless movement, but they're still talking about fallow land and making use of the land, but for the reasons of regaining land so they can make a living with environmental consciousness, but nevertheless putting that land to use in a farm. They target large land holdings of government or banks that have been neglected, and they occupy it, turning it into a working farm, and then petition the government for property rights. The movement is communitarian rather than capitalist, and their goal is to have a thriving community, not rich individuals. Farms that I had visited were also adamant about using farming practices that were sustainable, growing a variety of food and small crops instead of becoming large agribusiness farms. And so we can see that the idea of land belonging to those who use it can be, depending how you describe it, used for colonial or liberatory ends. There have been many cases of landless farmers in Central America occupying unused lands of large multinational fruit corporations so that as a group they can repossess it. I've visited some of these farms in Honduras. You may already know about these farms. In these cases, application of this principle of use can be helpful. But to make a quick mention of use as Aruka does without describing the history and the context, to me seems ripe for misunderstanding. Even as a principle of sibling relations within one family, it seems to me it would be highly contested. Which sibling ever easily acquiesces to their land or property being taken over by their more industrious siblings? And this is how he puts it out in his parental earth ethics, right? Some of those siblings can just take the land from the others. But in the context of this Brazil movement, the Honduras movement, this makes sense. This is taking it from exploitative corporations. Notably, despite lip service to this idea that those willing to work the soil should be given title deed, it was in many nations enforced only according to racial guidelines. African-American farmers who won freedom from slavery established productive farms and were often then driven off their land by racist neighbors. Since the 1920s, they were pushed off farms here in the US by racist applications of loans and laws. Maroon communities and Quilombo communities in Brazil who escaped slavery and went inland in Brazil, establishing farms and becoming self-supporting, were not usually given title deeds. They were pursued militarily and destroyed, as for example, the attack upon Palmares is chronicled by colonial government documents. Now, there was some attempt to revive and reinforce those rights of Quilombos, according to some of the more recent Brazilian legislation and under Lula and Dilma, for example. In Kenya also advocated a new national land policy in 2009 and had 3 new land laws in 2012, since the death of Aruka. There was a recognized need for land reform when it was realized that pressures due to scarce land were part of the heightened tensions around electoral violence in 2007. They recognized that land problems go back to colonial days when colonists took land for their tea estates, displacing communities that lived in that region. During independence years, corruption led to abuse of public lands, which were parceled out to individuals in a manner that was not transparent. In Kenya, 80% of people still make their living from agriculture, so the demand for land is high. Because implementation of land reform was moving so slowly, owing to land cases being bogged down in courts, in 2014, the government's National Land Commission announced it would use local village councils and headmen to decide the land cases. While Aruka may have been happy with such a development, others are worried that a move like this comes too late when already the authority of traditional elders is waning. For example, George Kimemia, an assistant chief from Kajiado North, said, "Old men of high integrity who resolve disputes with honesty and fairness are long gone, replaced by dishonest people at the land offices. People pay a lot of money to have their cases heard and determined in their favor. There is no justice." It's hard to know at this time whether Kenyans will be satisfied with the land reform projects of their government. Some researchers note that the devolution of powers in the new Kenyan constitution gave some local politicians and administrators veto power that slowed or stopped the hoped for land reform. In the meantime, private persons and companies have found a way to get private land deeds to public lands that were intended to house public government buildings like schools, police stations, and hospitals. This is clearly a reverse land reform, the commons being whittled away by private individuals with the help of corrupt public servants. And so you may all remember Wangari Maathai several times, the Karura Forest and other places, when she noticed there was corruption in Kenyan government, wanted to defend those commons, wanted to defend those forests. She saved Uhuru Park, Karura Forest, and a redistribution of wealth through a concrete redistribution of land in a society heavily dependent on agriculture is needed to have a more just society. And now I'm coming to my conclusion. You said I have more time, but I'm presuming I must be near the end. So I just want to say, Aruka certainly did well to draw our attention to a host of important ethical issues with both theoretical and practical implications. He was ahead of his time in his concern for environmental preservation. While he did not fully embrace ecocentrism, he was convinced that nature had worth and should be protected because it was so essentially interconnected. He saw issues of the environment linked with development and poverty reduction. A decolonial history of environmental thought, as Ferdinand requested, would have to include Aruka as part of that history, I think. It is up to Kenyans today to decide through careful weighing how they will determine their future, and that the role that women will have, since women need their land rights as well. So let me conclude on that note, and thank you all very much for listening.
Well, perhaps I'm moderating this panel, and I see that Kole Odutola has a question for you. I hope I'm pronouncing your name okay.
Well, thank you very much. And your argument is based principally on land, having it and not having it. And there is a paper by Kuma who looks at the etymology of the word colonialism. Because each time I have had presentations on decolonization, it is hardly the other side of a binary. Colonialism is hardly advanced. And Kuma, in his work with the Oromo of Ethiopia, had talked about the Latin root of the word colonialism, and that the Latin word of colonialism has to do with land and farmer. And that, so when you see the argument you have presented, you would see that the whole concept of decolonization is a return of a land to the former owners, because colonization happens to be, first and foremost, the land, the occupiers, those who occupy other people's lands, and those who occupy other people's minds, because colonialism works in tandem with the land and the mind. And that is why decolonization is not the same thing as deworming. You can deworm a child, but decolonization has totally altered the being and the psychology of a people. I don't think that anybody who is decolonized can return to status quo ante. For me to return to status quo ante, I have to purge myself first and foremost of the colonizer's language and the epistemology of a colonizer that I have used consistently to view the world. So coming back to your argument, I see that from all the three you have cited, the land is an important part. And that, of course, the very controversial argument or the plank on which those who do not use the land, others should use it. It's a very dangerous one, because the colonizer could as well use that. And I think also in the States here with indigenous people, you could also say that. But who is to determine how a land is being used? On the African continent, the farming system was such that it was sustainable. Sustainable in the sense that you farm a land, you leave it fallow for a while, for the land to rejuvenate and to recover itself from the nutrients you have taken. And then the capitalist concept, the capitalist concept of taking the very last from anything, the land, the people, laborers, and all, is what turned it on to that. And finally, you rightly said the idea of the certificate of occupancy, the deeds to the land. Land in Africa at some point in its existence was not a real estate property. It was not something to be exchanged for another thing. It was the utility of it. And like Ali Mazrui would say in Africa, the Triple Heritage, that Africans were not interested in using the sea as a means of navigating to conquer other people's lands, but they were interested in the resources in which the sea had. And it also formed the basis of some of their spirituality. So I am in agreement with the way you have used the land and how it has come. And anybody who has read anything about ecofeminism will know that some of these arguments have actually been advanced by ecofeminists. You know, the gender dimension to the social, the cultural, the political, and all, and especially the environment, and how women have been marginalized. You know, the idea in Eastern